In today's episode, we are going to share with you 5 tips on grieving with the 5 stages of grief in mind. We will be discussing the stages of grief and how it has become the main model for grievers. We have to ask ourselves, though, is it really what we think it is? Hi, everyone. This is Jeff and
Tony Brabeck
of Our Little Sparrows Pregnancy and Infant Loss Support. If you'd like to find out more about us, you can use the link in the description below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell so that you guys can get alerts when we release new content every week.
What do you know about the 5 stages of grief? Have you often referred to them as a measure on how well you are grieving? Today we are going to talk through the 5 stages of grief and how our society has adapted them as a measure of how one can cope with loss. The 5 stages of grief were presented by psychiatrist Elisabeth Kubler-Ross in her book called On Death and Dying. In this book, she outlines 5 common responses from persons who are facing their own death. The 5 responses or stages are 1. Denial, 2. Anger, 3. Bargaining, 4. Depression, and 5. Acceptance.
Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's book On Death and Dying was first published in 1969. We have to realize that. We have to put this in context. The book has since become a popular book. It's used by professionals and grievers all over the world. In fact, over the last 50 years, many still use her research and writings as sound resources, which it is a sound resource, but let's put that into perspective. So what happened? We have to ask ourselves, from the original context of the book to where we are today, what began to happen is that people began to take her model of stages of grief and begin to applying them to all types of grief, any grief, when she specifically meant it to be to one grief. So over time, her research and model became oversimplified, obviously. It takes on new life, almost. Grievers and professionals began to use this modified model as a means to measure how a person was grieving or should be grieving. It was taken out of context, and soon people believed that there was a particular order in the grief process and that it was limited to only these specific 5 stages and in a specific order, right?
Yes, I have even heard from others that once you have gone through the 5 stages of grief, you should be done grieving. And I even remember learning this model in school. And it wasn't until a few years ago after we lost our daughter, I didn't realize that the model I learned was completely different than how Elisabeth Kubler-Ross had originally intended for it to be received.
So soon grievers began to obviously identify with these 5 stages, right? It's a popular book. It's everywhere. They identified in one stage and therefore understood what the next stage would be, like it's a progression. So often grievers would feel like they were set back, or they would feel disappointed, or they let themselves down if they didn't move on to that next progression the way that they thought it was supposed to happen, right? According to what they thought or interpreted those 5 stages from the book. A lot of people didn't even read the book. They just saw the 5 stages and said, here I go, let's start the wheel, right? That kind of thing. It's crazy. So, I mean, obviously it's been 10 years, and why haven't I gotten to acceptance yet?
Yeah.
Is exactly what some people ask themselves.
Right. Yeah. So can one measure the grieving process using the 5 stages of grief? Not necessarily. The 5 stages of grief were not meant by the author to be applied to all types of grief, nor was it meant to be taken literally that there are only 5 stages, period. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief was specifically written to display common responses and conversations of a seriously ill person. This book was written to help professionals as well as their family supporting a person anticipating his or her own death. In this context, the 5 stages of grief make sense.
Completely. So we've included the links to her website. We'll actually link them in the description below, and also to her book. So we feel like it's a great resource. It has its place in context, of course. And so we want to make sure you guys have access to that. So with all that in mind, we have 5 tips to help you process your own grief. So tip number 1.
Yeah. Grief is complex and complicated. Grief is not limited to just 5 stages, or the modified version of the 5 stages. There are more emotions, feelings, and experiences than we can even keep track of ourselves.
Perfect. Tip number 2, there is no order to grief. It's not linear. It's not on a specific timeline. What we have to realize is grief is all over the place, right? And that's normal and natural.
Yes.
Say it again, normal and natural. So you may start off in denial. This is a good example. You may start off in denial, but then you may jump to depression, then back to denial, then anger, and including maybe things that not even are stated in the 5 stages of grief. And that is fine. It's a process.
Yeah, absolutely. And tip number 3, just recognize that there is no set timeline. The grief does not end after 5 stages and everything will feel all better.
Yeah.
Emotions and thoughts you feel after loss continue to shape themselves in your life as you continue to move through life.
Right. So I think there's some exceptions to the rule. I think goals are important and milestones are part of that. So no harm, no foul to, set a goal. But if you don't hit it, give yourself some grace.
Yes. And we also want to acknowledge that there are intense times of grief, but there will also be calm moments and calm days.
Right.
So, and some may not even actually experience their grief until months or years later.
Right.
And that's okay.
Yep. Another tip number 4, grieving is okay. Grief is important. It is part of the human nature to feel grief when we have lost something. And loss, again, takes on many forms, many faces.
Yes. And tip number 5, grief is different for every person. Some of us may feel intense grief initially after loss. Others may not experience it until months or years later. And all of that is okay.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
It's good. So again, there is a place for the 5 stages of grief. We totally agree with it in context. But let's not forget that there's more to the human being than those 5 stages. And grief is normal and natural. And let's allow ourselves to process that.
Yeah.
Everyone experiences grief in their own way. There is no set way, no particular way one should deal with loss. That's exactly what this series is all about. However, there can be common responses. It is really as individual as the person and situation in itself. Knowing this and that grief is a normal and natural reaction to loss, that means we have freedom. Freedom from any expectation that society may put on us that we need to fit a certain pattern or even a narrative. Now, we hope that you guys found this episode helpful. We want you to know that you are not alone. You are loved and your baby will always be cherished. And we're here to support you in any way that we can.
If you got value out of this video, please give us a thumbs up so others can find us. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell to get updates for when we release new content every week. If you liked this episode and want to see another video podcast, click or tap here. If you are looking for more in-depth information, we have a grief series called The Pregnancy Journey, grieving from diagnosis to the loss of your baby and beyond. You can click or tap here.